Programmed to Chill, a show about business, crime, parapolitics, and esoterica, with your host, Jimmy Falun Gong.
All right. Now, listeners will probably recall that George joined me on the Nick Bryant interview, but I would like to reintroduce George. George is the founder of the Coalition Against Voter Disenfranchisement and Election Fraud. He's also the curator of CAVDEF's inexhaustible website, which is in the show notes, which is just a phenomenal resource. George is an incredible researcher. He does groundbreaking work in various fields, ranging from Ted Bundy, the abduction of Johnny Gosch, the JonBenet Ramsey case, and one of my favorite topics that he's, largely discovered, the White Eagle Underground. How are you doing today, George?
I'm doing great, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on again.
Definitely. Okay, let me ask you this just before we get right into the meat of the thing.
Yeah.
What was your path getting into this stuff? Because for me, I guess it was through learning about CIA history, and then I only later got into more of the true crime angle. And so what was your path?
Yeah, I had the weirdest fucking path. It was I started, in 2016, I was a hardcore Bernie Sanders guy. And,
Nice.
yeah, it was pretty much my first time caring about politics at all. And I, was very much into the, progressive sphere of things. And I, was very much behind Bernie. And then seeing what happened to him throughout the primaries was disappointing. But then when I started learning about, the shit that was going on in places like Arizona, and then, realizing the anomalies in the exit polls and stuff, it went from me being disappointed to me feeling that there was actually an injustice that was going on, with the elections being stolen. And so I really dove into learning about, the ways that elections are rigged in the U.S. That made me start learning about past elections that were stolen, like George W. Bush's elections in 2000, 2004. And, effectively learning about this historical pattern of elections being fixed for the pro-establishment, pro-corporate candidate is sort of what began awakening me to the idea of a greater level of power beyond what we see in electoral politics.
So I really appreciate that, because I was content mainly to look up some Daniel Hopsicker stuff and be like, damn, that's fucked up. But you legitimately researched it yourself, the election stuff. That's wild to me.
Well, I appreciate that, but honestly, it went in stages. It really was me just looking up information about that other people had documented the stuff by people like Jonathan Simon, who published these analyses in Bev Harris of black box voting, and it just came to a point where eventually I was like, well, I'm not just going to be sitting here spinning my wheels and being mad about it. What can I do to catch the bastards who did it? And so, tried to dig into the backgrounds of the voting machine companies and the election contractors, and just started, realizing certain weird patterns that threaded their way through all of this, realizing that a lot of these people had common backgrounds regarding organized crime, drug trafficking. That sort of made me aware of the CIA history of doing that. And from there, I sort of leapt into a bunch of other conspiracy rabbit holes, like the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. And then, I guess, later that year, Pizzagate was coming out, and I also became aware of the pedophile ring stuff. And at first I was like, this is kind of bullshit, but then, seeing stuff about the Franklin scandal and realizing the overlap it had with election fraud because, the World Herald owned the biggest voting machine company in the US, I started taking that more seriously as well. And, ultimately spending a lot of time in the pedophile ring angle of things is, I guess, and also learning about the mind control aspect that came out of there, I guess eventually led me to Program to Kill. And that's how I got into the true crime side of things.
Definitely. So it definitely sounds like, although our paths were not the same, similar influences in several of these cases. So I really appreciate that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unconventional path, but I do think that, having the background with election fraud kind of gives an important
Mm,
perspective. I mean, a lot of people, I guess, seem to think, I mean, they just say, oh yeah, it's both sides suck. It's all, everyone's in on it. It's like, yes, but you still need to know the mechanisms by which this gets perpetuated. And there is a massive, propaganda thing that's achieved by rigging elections in a certain way repeatedly over the course of many decades.
exactly. Yeah. One day I should have you on to just explain that to me because, like, I'm very interested and I really have only just read like a few Hopsicker articles. So I think that'd be really cool.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to do a election rigging show as well. I think there's a lot we could cover and a lot of weird parapolitical connections to that.
Just like with, until fairly recently, no one really wanted to talk about pedophile rings. I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like people really don't like to talk about election rigging.
No, they really don't. And I mean, it's somewhat flipped, like who is the like
Hmm.
who was willing to and who was unwilling to. For a while, Republicans hated you if you brought it up, and the maybe not the Democratic Party proper, but at least the liberal slash lefty activist crowd
Hmm.
was somewhat willing to entertain it, especially in wake of the 2004 election of Bush, and then come to the 2016 season where you basically get Trump. I mean, you basically get Trump saying, "Oh, if I lose, it was rigged," and suddenly it becomes, "Wow, this rhetoric is dangerous. How could you ever challenge election outcomes?" And at that point, it pretty much becomes the Republican base and even Republican politicians who are the only ones willing to talk about that. And of course, that really climaxes in 2020 with Stop the Steal and has been going on even more powerfully. I mean, still is kind of a big deal since. It's so, yeah, I mean, it's the way that people are propagandized to believe it or abhor it at certain times is very interesting too.
Yeah, it's viewed as the domain of pure crankery when in reality it is just mind-boggling that these companies are just like mafia operations and they just like are seemingly, there's at least the risk. Like it's like just it's ridiculous. Like why is it like that?
Right, like it's kind of weird that everyone just accepts this as the state of affairs, and obviously by design, you can't really prove an election is stolen with if you can't see what's going on inside the computers. But they're even still there's a pretty very compelling circumstantial evidence in a lot of elections that it has happened, and
Hmm.
also, I mean, tends to correlate with concerted efforts by election officials to prevent anyone from doing an honest recount whenever an election is questioned, which obviously raises the question of why, if everything is on the up and up, you constantly have to, remove all transparency and completely subvert the process and sometimes run a very overtly fraudulent affair to uh, get to derail these recount efforts. It's an instance I say where the cover up proves the crime.
Yeah, and then just one more thing, right? Basically, I feel like there is on the left, the US left, such as it is, there is a tendency to acknowledge that voting can be rigged in other countries and that it happens, but not a lot of interest in confronting the fact that it happens here too.
Yeah, it is definitely seen as the kind of thing that would only happen, under Vladimir Putin, for example. But or a so-called third world country. But yeah, you could never imagine it happening here. And the other weird thing about it too is that the Democrat, liberal left crowd, whatever you want to call it, will acknowledge that elections can be rigged in every way up to and including voter suppression. They will not hesitate to claim that Republicans deliberately suppress the vote, and that is very much true in my eyes, but they stop at a willingness to say anything about the count of the votes themselves. That even,
Mm-hmm.
if going to the votes that actually are cast are those counted accurately, that is really the third rail that a lot of Democrats will not touch. And Jonathan Simon, who wrote the book Code Red, has highlighted some weird things about it. That he talked to this in Democratic National Committee pollster who basically said, "Oh yeah, in our internal polls, whenever we see our guy 10 points ahead, that means that it's actually a close race, like a dead heat." And it's like, why the fuck would these internal polls, which are not designed for any like PR bullshit purposes, they're designed to be maximally accurate. So, accounting for any non-response issues, they should be, they basically are meant to show exactly what the election is like and do whatever is needed in the weighting process to account for that. So why, if they're doing everything in their power to get the right results and they're still seeing a massive discrepancy, and they don't assume there's anything wrong with that, they just think, oh, that's the way it is. There's always just a built-in bias for our side that we have no explanation for, but it definitely couldn't be the elections being rigged for the Republicans. That couldn't be happening.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? Because, like, I know now, like, your story and how you were interested in that and then developed these other interests. But, like, I remember the first time I ever went to your website, and I think it was actually before I listened to you on the Farm podcast. I was like looking up something about Franklin or something related to Franklin. And like I found the website and I was just like, Coalition Against Voter Disenfranchisement. Why do they have such like really good information on this freaking pedophile ring? Like, what the hell?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I think a lot of people end up confused when they see that. Probably confused the other way too. Like, oh, I was looking up information on the election. Why is there this weird shit about satanic cult on here?
Exactly. And it's interesting, right? Because like in this field that I guess we're both in, I feel like there are different like white whales, just general topics that like you and I and probably everyone involved wishes that like we could just crack that, right? Like Michael
Yeah,
Aquino is one, the Jean Benet Ramsey case is one, it goes on and on. And one that we're going to talk about today, of course, and listeners already know because of the title of the episode and so forth, is the Henry Lee Lucas affair. And how do we put this? Like, Henry Lee Lucas is an extremely interesting case, right?
yeah.
And I wrote up this whole introduction, but I'm kind of wandering around it. But like, it kind of feels like what you think about Henry Lee Lucas reflects more about you than it does about Lucas himself.
Yeah, and that is something that's even made, that's a point that's made by Nan Cuba, one of the journalists who was on the case from nearly the beginning in the Netflix documentary as well, that it's more, people can apply their own perspective to it and effectively, draw their own interpretation that's just derived from where they're coming from initially. And Henry Lee Lucas himself kind of facilitates that in that he is almost a chameleonic figure, depending on the circumstances he was in at a given time, would
Mm-hmm.
adapt to them and sort of be molded by them and could be very pliable towards one set of captors or the other set of captors or whoever family or friends he was with at the time. It is a very, very interesting study and makes it a particularly difficult matter to crack for sure.
Yeah, I know that you're very well acquainted with Ted Bundy. Do you get the read that Lucas did some of a similar thing where he would sort of tell the person he was talking to kind of what they wanted to hear to a certain extent?
That definitely does seem to be the case, and that's something that, for example, the head of the Texas Ranger Task Force that had Lucas for quite some time, that was arranging different law enforcement officers to interview him. The head of the task force would basically say, if Lucas likes you, he will try to confess to your crime. And he, depending on his attitude towards the people, he would try to please them, give them what they wanted. He would, and he would have the ability to take information in and mix it together in his mind with different things in the past. And effectively, that would, allow a sort of ever-changing, fluid narrative from Henry's mouth at any given point.
Mm, exactly. And like, I feel like if people know about Henry, like the average person who's maybe not completely programmed to kill pilled, but like is interested in true crime and maybe has a certain finger on the pulse of like some of this parapolitical stuff, chances are, right, the general consensus about Henry Lee Lucas has swung dramatically, right? So, like in the 90s, somewhere maybe at a certain point, Henry Lee Lucas was held up to be the most prolific serial killer. And then now we're at such a point of revisionism where it's disputed that he killed any more than maybe like 2 or 3 people, right?
That's right. Yeah, it is pretty amazing. It sort of swings from one sensational side of the narrative to another. That it goes from, Henry Lee Lucas, the deranged killer who probably murdered hundreds of people across the U.S., to Henry Lee Lucas, this dopey guy who probably killed a couple people, and then he was just used as a confession machine to close a bunch of other cases, and that he really wasn't a mass murderer by any means. It is very interesting how much that's shifted, and how much the narrative has completely gone to that other extreme, to the point where, in any sort of true crime community, if Henry Lee Lucas is brought up, it's sort of the unsaid consensus. No one it really disputes the idea that Lucas's confessions were basically just a big hoax. Everyone pretty much responds that way without thinking, without questioning it. There isn't really any dissenting view that you can find to that. It just sort of becomes internalized within the true crime community as exactly what Lucas was. And it really, a lot of the same claims are repeated, even in the absence of specific evidence to back it up. Very general claims, like the idea that, oh yeah, Lucas was definitely just being able to, with always being fed information, with always being able to look at case files, and he must have just, remembered this information from one cop and then regurgitated it to another cop. There's all these generalities about cases, things that may well and very likely did happen in individual cases of Henry Lee Lucas, sort of get extrapolated to represent the entirety of Lucas's confessions, whether or not that's actually proven. It's a very, very complicated matter involving hundreds of murder confessions all over the country over a span of many years, and there's so much intricate detail to probe into, and the nuance of it just seems to get lost. People who are familiar with Ross Chait's witch hunt narrative regarding sex ritual abuse cases like McMartin, Country Walk, and similar ones throughout the 80s. It's a very similar pattern to that, the narrative effectively shifts from highly sensationalized reporting of these, very lurid satanic rituals, more or less unchallenged in the press. And at a certain point, when these cases start to fizzle out, not go as successfully as would be desired, there's just this sort of backlash that starts to question all of the things that have been reported, and it points out the incredible sensationalism and the lack of skepticism, but it goes to a complete lack of skepticism in the other direction of claiming that none of this stuff ever happened. And, it basically is an overcorrection to the other side that doesn't really get you to the truth more successfully than was being reported before. And that's the difficulty with cases like these, of trying to find a reasonably objective look at things that doesn't just pigeonhole it into one very convenient narrative.
Yeah, I really like that. Like, I think we are seeing a classic, like, swing such as you would see with the Satanic Panic, where it's like they're moving from like Henry Lee Lucas being the most prolific serial killer to he's like literally not a serial killer territory. And
Yep.
I think today we're going to work towards an understanding that suggests that he was in fact a serial killer, and that many but not all of his confessions were actually accurate. Is that your read on this?
That's right. Yeah, and it is ultimately, I think the lesson is you have to look at it on a case by case basis, and you have to understand all of the different political and parapolitical factors that were at play here. This was a very big media circus and political circus between different apparent factions within various state and local and federal agencies, applying different types of pressure and different influences on Lucas and the people around him. And you have to really grasp the entire thing to and go to all of the different cases that he is attributed to, and try to come to some sort of cohesive understanding on a more individual basis.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we are, as always, holding it down for the Dave McGowan thesis here, not because we have any personal loyalty to a man that, I've never met. It's simply because it appears that Dave McGowan was correct in this case, and that's the value there. Like, he wrote what he wrote about Henry Lee Lucas, and then I've found information which Dave McGowan didn't know, which bolsters Dave's assessment. And George has found even more information, which really builds out that general framework that Lucas was in fact a serial killer, and that that the hand of death is real, basically.
That's right. Yeah.
But maybe to just set the stage here, right? Let's go through some of the Lucas story, and we'll get to the point where George can lay out his amazing finds. So, like George said, the Lucas confessions have a very lurid, sensational element to them. We're talking confessions of rape, torture, mutilation, dismemberment, necrophilia, cannibalism, and pedophilia. Like, very rough stuff. And, like we said, Lucas confessed to somewhere between 300 to 600 victims. Actually, let me ask you just up front there, George, what's the deal with the range of victims? What was it, 300 or 600, or what's your take on that?
Well, what I would say, I mean, it does appear to be in the multiple hundreds of total confessions that Lucas made. About 300 seems accurate, at least as far as what gets recorded in the Texas Ranger Task Force files. But of course, only a subset of those are actually considered to be confirmed cases, cases that the individual law enforcement agencies believed were done by Lucas. That was more like 150 cases or so. And then, of course, depending on how well the law enforcement agency did things, the confirmation can be more or less valid. The evidence can be more or less solid. So it is important, obviously, to bear in mind that there's a distinction between a confession and a confession that's actually believed to be true, and then the different levels of certainty within that. Someone who makes a lot of false confessions also has the capacity to make a lot of true confessions, and that is another thing that gets lost, the number that's made versus the number that's actually believed.
Yeah, because when I was looking through the documents you sent me, I was like, this is not 600. This isn't even 300. There's just like you said. Now, I'd like to quote Dave McGowan from Program to Kill. I'm not going to read all the different sections he wrote, but one in particular I think stands out. What Henry claimed essentially is that what appeared to be the random work of a serial killer was in fact a planned series of crimes, often committed for specific purposes. Some of the murders were political hits, according to Henry, including assassination of foreign dignitaries, local politicians, and wealthy businessmen. This was not true for all of Henry's crimes. Some he did just because he liked to do it. Some he did just because that is what he liked to do. And it was one thing that he was really good at. The beauty of this arrangement was that it allowed Henry to conceal the true motive for many of his crimes. Those performed as contract hits looked like all of his murders, senseless and random acts of violence, unquote. So one of the many hypotheses in the Program to Kill book is that sometimes serial killers are doing contract hits. And that is something that I will admit the book Program to Kill does not always prove very clearly, nor is it maybe possible to prove that, but you do see it time and time again in a bunch of these serial killer cases where it'll be like seemingly random victims, and then it'll be like basically like a family's wiped out, but the guy, the man is like a mafia member or something. Can you like speak on that, George?
Yeah, it is a strangely common aspect of many serial killer cases where there's a victim who appears to be a very convenient victim in the sense of you question whether they were involved in something else that might have led to their death, and you wouldn't necessarily think that they had been killed randomly. Your immediate instinct would be this probably is some kind of contract hit or gang hit, and it's only the fact that they are linked to this quote unquote serial killer that leads that to appear to be the case in the first place. Thinking about how the Ripper crew in Chicago supposedly committed this drive-by shooting, which probably would have been assumed to be the work of some gang in Chicago, if not for this connection here. What you mentioned about drug dealers being bumped off by these supposedly random serial killers in places like L.A. or the Santa Cruz area, and with Ted Bundy in particular, a lot of his crime, a lot of his alleged crimes, especially ones happening in Colorado, have very much bear the hallmarks of connections to, locally corrupt law enforcement and organized crime operations there. It's always, like you said, a thing that's very hard to pin down, but it's an aspect that seems to come up again and again. And sometimes it is even overtly claimed that this is what's going on. As Dave McGowan pointed out in the Son of Sam case, which allegedly was just David Berkowitz acting alone, murdering several women and their partners as well in New York City. It ultimately, there was evidence coming out that Berkowitz was part of a larger satanic cult, and that some of these murders were actually not just randomly targeted victims, but were pre-selected victims, so-called target crimes, for particular reasons that were not told to the individual gunmen on the street, but for whatever reason, the leadership of this cult decided to target particular victims, for specific victims, for whatever reason. So it is something that has occasionally been alleged very specifically about serial killer cases, but oftentimes you have very bizarre clues suggesting that these murders would be assumed to be some kind of targeted reason, if not for the fact that it got linked to this random motiveless killer.
Precisely. And I feel like there are hints of that in several cases. You listed off a few. There's the possibility that it occurred with Richard Ramirez, with Israel Keys. There's probably several more that I'm forgetting, like
John Wayne Gacy is a big one, where one of his attributed victims, John Boutwell, was said to be involved in the drug trade and hanging around with Puerto Ricans there, Puerto Ricans in Chicago. And then there was a collect call coming in from Puerto Rico, basically saying, "Oh, he's over here. Don't worry about investigating it." And of course, the many the connection that Gacy had to a sex trafficking ring in Chicago as well, with John Norman and Philip Paskey. So yes, it is an aspect that comes up again and again in a very uncanny pattern.
Exactly. And I feel like the Henry Lee Lucas case might be one of the cases where it's clearer that is happening. That's my contention. Would you agree with that?
I would say yes, and even that that Henry Lee Lucas is quite possibly, as we'll see, one of these sort of a very low level example of this, but an example nonetheless of one of the true sort of one of the operatives used by this underground network of organized violence to carry out murders on behalf of this cryptocracy, if you will, murders for organized crime and political purposes. And that effectively, when Lucas was caught, they basically caught one member of this network, and one who happened to be unusually candid about some of its inner workings, which I would argue led to some of the responses to Lucas that later happened, and the way that he was later treated, and ended up recanting most of his confessions.
That's right. And then we'll definitely flesh this out, but there is also the distinct possibility that Lucas may have been, to a certain degree, and at least by a certain time, confessing to crimes that he didn't do, but that the hand of death did. That is the theoretical group that Lucas would have been a part of, right?
Yeah, and even for people who are not necessarily don't necessarily believe in the hand of death, or were ambivalent about it, it certainly is acknowledged among even more mainstream reporters of the Lucas story that Lucas being known to have this excellent memory for places and times and people that he was involved with, that he may well have internalized the crimes of other people who he was with, especially his traveling companion Otis Toole, who was implicated, who Henry implicated in many of the murders along with him. there obviously is the possibility that some of Otis Toole's own crimes became ones that Henry got in his mind and confessed to in place of Toole. So, this idea that Henry could have become aware of other crimes through people who he associated with and then confessed to them is a very real possibility as well.
Precisely. And just like we said, then at a specific juncture, Henry Lee Lucas recanted all of these confessions, virtually all of them, except for basically the fact that he murdered his mother, right? Now he was already convicted of.
Basically, it got down to the point where Henry Lee Lucas was only willing to admit responsibility for 3 murders. His mother, like you said, the murder of Becky Powell was his teenage, people always say girlfriend or common law wife. Obviously, it's a little bit creepy to say that about a teenage girl, but nevertheless, that's what she is considered to be. She was the niece of Otis Toole and was traveling with Henry for quite a while, and then ultimately, she vanished, and later Henry Lucas did confess to her murder and even led authorities to her where her remains were. And then the murder a month later of an elderly woman named Kate Rich, who was in the area where Lucas and Becky were, the 2 of them, and may have been expressing skepticism about Lucas' story of what happened to Becky. And Lucas also was able to lead investigators to remains of Kate Rich. So really only those 3 cases, by the end of it, Lucas was willing to admit to. And even to some extent, he denied responsibility for those 2 murders as well. So yeah, sometimes it got to the point where Lucas was only willing to admit involvement in murdering his mother. And even then, that one too, he would sometimes try to pass it off as an accident, a non-premeditated incident, claiming, oh, I swung at her and I didn't realize until afterwards that I had a knife in my hand.
Yeah, I think that's what he says in one of the books, which we'll talk about as well. It's interesting, right? Because if you were to read, dear listeners, the early paragraphs of the Henry Lee Lucas Wikipedia page, you will read, more likely than not, you'll read the following. Lucas's case damaged the reputation of the Texas Rangers, caused a reevaluation in police techniques, and caused greater awareness of the possibility of false confessions. Investigators did not consider that the ostensibly trivial comforts such as steak dinners, milkshakes, and access to television in return for confession to crimes of extreme seriousness might encourage prisoners such as Lucas, who had little to lose, to make false confessions. Investigators also let Lucas see the case file so he could, quote, refresh his memory, unquote, making it easy to seemingly demonstrate knowledge of the facts that only the perpetrator would know. The police also did not record their interviews, making it impossible to know for sure how much information interviewers accidentally gave Lucas unprompted, unquote. Now, like we said, we're going to challenge this true crime Netflix view of Henry Lee Lucas. And it is not to say that the panic version is correct. It's not that 300 to 600 murders were committed by Henry Lee Lucas. No, I think we are going to attempt to bring the view of Henry Lee Lucas somewhere into reality, or in as much as we can, right? Because it really appears that the truth was so much more complicated than most prolific serial killer versus just a liar making false confessions. It was not just a hoax, and the reality appears to be much, much darker. But let me ask you this, George, before we get into the meat of the episode, do you recall the first time you heard of and looked up Henry Lee Lucas, and what did you think?
Yeah, I do. And it probably is the same way that a lot of listeners first came across it, through engaging with Dave McGowan's work, reading Program to Kill, for example. And when I first read Program to Kill and I heard the whole account, the infamous account of how Henry Lee Lucas was the only person during George W. Bush's time as governor to get a death sentence commuted, I certainly found that incredibly bizarre, that someone who would be apparent background of Lucas, who no one seemed to deny was a murderer, and no one seemed to deny was at the very least, some a very sadistic and fucked up individual. That why would he be the only one who George W. Bush was willing to give that sort of reprieve to, as if there was nobody else on death row in Texas who had any remotely questionable case, any sort of case for possible innocence whatsoever. And so obviously that stuck out to me. It was very weird to me. And then reading the very strange account that Henry Lee Lucas made about being in the hand of death, being a contract murderer for a cult, and then seeing, as Dave McGowan painstakingly laid out, all the parallels to other cases like the Son of Sam, the Monster of Florence, and bringing up certain pieces of corroborating evidence, like the existence of these satanic cults in the very same places where Lucas described that were found after he told a story. It certainly started to paint a very disturbing picture in my head of wow, I could not have conceived that the world was anything like this, but how are these same stories coming up again and again, and how else do you explain this bizarre action that George W. Bush took towards such a figure as Henry Lee Lucas? But of course, it's whenever I came across something in McGowan's work in the conspiracy world saying something so outlandish like this, it is a habit to go and see, well, okay, here's what the conspiracy is. What is the mainstream view of this guy? Because I'd never heard of him before. And of course, I quickly came into the mainstream viewpoint of Henry Lee Lucas as this serial false confessor who quite possibly was not even a real serial killer at all, and was basically just a bullshitter who was lying to puff himself up or get better privileges in jail, as the current Wikipedia outline that you just described says. And so I was very much caught between these two things, wondering how to reconcile the two, that what you got these two completely different views of Lucas, and based on the evidence that was presented in the different places where you're reading it, both of them seemed very compelling based on the facts that they were presenting. And it really began for me this multi-year effort to try and dig and get to the bottom of what Lucas really was. And it went in stages for me, for sure, that every so often I would come across little tidbits of evidence here and there, and just certain things that either added corroboration to things Lucas said, or there would be little places I would find here and there that a few places that were willing to challenge the apparent consensus about Lucas not being a serial killer, like for example Michael Newton's Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, which was one of the few places I found that would actually argue that Lucas did kill a great number of victims. And so it just started compiling together more and more information, and eventually led me down to doing a lot more in-depth investigation of the claims about Lucas's recantations, and contacting with certain people who were involved in the case directly, including the head of the Texas Ranger Task Force, Bob Prince, to try and get more evidence and more understanding of this. And so, yeah, it was a very long journey, but it was enough to really get a hold of me, get a hold of my mind, trying to get to the bottom of this very bizarre set of circumstances. There's this endless complexity that the Lucas case really opens the door to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, there's something really sinister about these Netflix documentaries, because it really tells a overly simple story that really we'll get into it more in a second. I mean, we won't go all the way into this right now, but the Netflix story really tells this very pat story where you can feel clever because you can, you think, oh yeah, well, obviously they didn't think that maybe he could be making a false confession, when in reality, old school policing was all about this type of thing. If there's one thing homicide detectives in the old days used to understand, it was that, you control information and you grant it, like, you don't let the person you're interviewing know too much to see, if they're telling the truth, right?
Yeah, definitely. It very much comes across as, like you said, this sort of cliche type of narrative where you know what to expect, and it's very much setting it up for you to be like, oh no, duh, wow, these cops are such idiots. How is this? It's like it has a very clear, I would say, and it has a very clear set of protagonists you're meant to follow along with, particular journalists,
Mm-hmm.
particular public officials who you're meant to root for, as it looks like these are the only people who are seeking the truth, and all these other law enforcement officers are just sitting on their hands. They're letting obvious lies rack up, and obviously, it's not a documentary that completely cuts out one side. The controversial members of the Texas Ranger Task Force, including Bob Prince, who I mentioned, they are given a chance to speak, but the way that they're presented as speaking, they come across, they can come across as you know callous. They're made to look as if they're it's like, oh yeah, these stodgy old Texas lawmen are definitely defending this shit, and they're just clinging to it in the face of all this overwhelming evidence. It's set up in a way that feels kind of superficially balanced, and that you let the other side say their piece, but you're putting it in a context where it's made to look like they're just effectively covering their ass. And it is a sort of endemic thing where you have this very simple narrative that comes up in this true crime show. You let people feel very smart for going along with it and seeing exactly where the narrative is going, and then it becomes so thoroughly internalized by the true crime community, as I mentioned before, that no one, everyone thinks that this is pretty much the final word on it, and it's not something that needs to be questioned anymore. And it gets so ingrained that certain troubling details about particular individual cases of Lucas are essentially turned into a general understanding of this is how bad it was for every single case Lucas was involved in. So it becomes a sort of all-consuming viewpoint that replaces any sort of more in-depth analysis.
Precisely. Now, let's shift into the early chronology of Henry Lee Lucas's life. So Henry Lee Lucas was born in August 23rd, 1936 in Blacksburg, Virginia. He had a nightmarish sounding childhood, perhaps only matched by the even worse upbringing that Otis Toole had, which sounds truly demonic. But Lucas did not have it easy. Lucas's mother was a prostitute. Lucas reported having experienced childhood sexual abuse. He reported torturing animals. He claims to have committed his first murder at around the age of 14 or 15. Now, in 1954, when Henry Lee Lucas was 18 years old, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for 12 counts of robbery. He escaped prison in 1956, but he was recaptured after 2 days. He would later be released in 1959. Now, an interesting aside here, and I think you have a note on this, but Lucas was recaptured in Ohio and he was sentenced to federal prison there for 13 months before he was returned to Virginia to finish his sentence. Lucas served his federal sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Institute, where Charles Manson had served time only a few years earlier and where the serial killer Thomas Creech would also serve time later in the 1970s. Was that the note you added, George? Did I read your part?
No, you were supposed to read that.
Okay, cool. Because I was like, I don't remember. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
As long as it's good. Okay. Now, so basically we have a classic troubled upbringing, life of crime, increasingly long rap sheet type of thing. On January 11th, 1960, Henry Lee Lucas killed his own mother. Now, what seems to have happened is that she had a heart attack while bleeding out after Lucas stabbed her in the neck. So, consequently, he was arrested and convicted of second-degree murder. He got a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison. At this point in his life, Lucas was 24 years old. Now, for real programmed chillheads out there, you may recall premium episode 27, which I also unlocked, where I pretty much laid out the following information. And mind you, this is not information you see covered in true crime content. I have seen other people talk about it, but not fully contextualized. But basically, I found that Henry Lee Lucas was sent to Ionia State Hospital in Michigan after he was convicted for the murder of his mother. The significance of that is that Ionia State Hospital essentially was MKULTRA subproject 39. Or I should say, the subproject took place there. And I'll quote from the research proposal and experimental design documents. And I quote, "The subjects will be selected from 142 criminal sexual psychopaths on whom there is an adequate previous investigation, including police reports, physical, psychiatric, and psychologic examinations, and social histories. The age range of the subjects varies from 20 to 70 years, and there is a wide variation of intelligence levels and social backgrounds. 3 teams of 2 senior professional men will be selected. The first team working with selected group of patients will use interrogation, hypnosis with LSD, and hypnosis with a tetrahydrocannabinol acetate derivative. Another team working on another group of subjects will use straight interrogation, LSD with interrogation, and THC derivative and interrogation. Later, the third team will use a group of subjects. Later, the third team with another group of subjects will use straight interrogation and a combination of LSD and THC derivative." Now, my words here. To make that more clear, I will quote from the book The CIA Doctors. "Ionia State Hospital was the site of MKUltra Subproject 39, which investigators cleared at top secret, receiving $30,000 in 1955 for drug testing on prisoners and sexual psychopaths including interrogation with hypnosis, LSD, and marijuana, unquote. Now, my words here again. Following that MKUltra subproject, those relationships did not just stop, and Ionia continued to get human ecology funds. They also started to look into psychosurgery, and they were specifically studying quote unquote uncontrollable aggression. So we have MKUltra studying sexual psychopathy, and then subsequent studies on uncontrollable aggression. Both sexual psychopathy and uncontrollable aggression are crucial factors in the Henry Lee Lucas story. Now, Henry Lee Lucas said that during this precise period, when he was at Ionia, a transition took place in him, and upon his release, he was determined to kill people. We know that while he was at Ionia, he received electroshock therapy, behavioral therapy. He was given a wide range of chemicals. And he told doctors if he was released, he would kill again. There's a quote here. When they put me on parole, I said, I'm not ready to go. I told them all, the warden, the psychologist, everybody, that I was going to kill. Now, we know that in 1970, Henry Lee Lucas was released from Ionia. The reason given was, quote unquote, overcrowding. Now, in my previous episode where I talk about this, I called this a smoking gun for Dave McGowan's Program to Kill thesis. George, and I don't ask this just to flatter myself, what do you make of these findings?
No, you don't have to add that qualifier, Jimmy. I was blown away. It's one of the very tricky things that I think we all run into as Program to Kill researchers, that you can have these very compelling patterns, patterns that make it look like these are contract murders, or patterns that make it look like these serial killers are affiliated with these institutions that are probably doing mind control experiments. But being able to actually prove that that was happening is nearly impossible. And of course, it is nearly impossible by design. Most of these documents were destroyed by the CIA after, of course, claiming that they had no successes. And what's been able to get pieced together since then is always by its nature incomplete. There's probably even more that just never gets written down in the first place, or is only written down in various private entities and never makes it to government files. So there's always going to be a gap between what you can document and what is really going on. But the fact that we are, in fact, able to document an MKUltra project going on at the institution where this serial killer is staying, and we can document that they themselves are, they are at this institution, they're being subjected to drug therapy and electroshock therapy, the same kinds of things that we find in mind control experiments, is incredibly, it's incredibly groundbreaking as a finding. I would say, it probably is the closest that we have ever come to any sort of proof that one of these subjects in Program to Kill, or subjects along those same lines, actually was in a mind control program. And the way that Lucas describes it only gives more fodder to that idea. The fact that he comes in as someone with various list of certain a predisposition to violence, to be sure, and certain lower level crimes like burglary under his belt as well, and has at least the murder of his mother, possibly another murder as a kid, but certainly does not appear at that moment to be a driven serial killer who is compulsively violent. He, by his own account, after enduring multiple years of quote unquote treatment in Ionia, he ends up getting this incredibly pronounced desire to kill as many people as possible. So this treatment actually apparently made Henry Lee Lucas far more violent, which would seem to be the opposite purpose if treatment is actually the goal. But if the actual goal is creating a programmed killer, as the goal of MKUltra was, as much as that now gets obfuscated in a lot of the mainstream coverage, then it would appear that objective was accomplished perfectly. And some of the things that Henry Lee Lucas says, he's quoted in the book just titled Henry Lee Lucas by Joel Norris, which is also heavily ghostwritten by Nan Cuba, the woman who I mentioned earlier appearing in the documentary. Henry Lee Lucas basically said that, after going through his drug therapy, Thorazine was one major drug that was used there, and then going through the electroshock, he basically, says, it went on until I couldn't even, think for myself. I couldn't even do anything for myself. It basically deconstructed, his entire mind, brought him back to being a baby, in his own words. He had to relearn everything, how to eat, how to walk. So he basically was, again, by his own account of what happened in Ionia, completely broken down and rebuilt up into the person he became after Ionia. So he spent about half of his time in prison in Ionia. Then he was transferred back to the regular penitentiary, and as you say, he was released in 1970 due to alleged overcrowding, even though he had told pretty much anyone in a position to approve the release that he was very determined to kill people again once he made it out of prison.
Precisely. And as we're going to see, the strong possibility that Henry Lee Lucas was subjected to some kind of mind control is not only theoretically possible based on these findings, but based on George's new findings, we're going to see that this is unfortunately very distinct probability. Which, man, when I was looking through that stuff with you, I was freaking out. I was like, oh shit.
Yeah, it is wild. There's just so many clues when you really get into the meat of these individual cases that Lucas was part of.
So let's get into his post-Ionia and post-prison activities. So basically, it went something like this. In late June of 1970, Henry Lee Lucas was paroled from prison. He was rearrested on a parole violation the September of the following year, so 1971. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but he was rearrested because he attempted to kidnap 3 underage girls, right?
Yeah, now I should say the various news accounts differ on whether it was 3 girls or whether it was 2 girls or whether it was 1 girl. But certainly Henry Lee Lucas was involved in trying to kidnap at least some underage girls. So that also shows, predisposition to pedophilia and kidnapping, which is another thing that makes this appearance later on in Henry Lee Lucas's crime spree, and of course is a attribute common to many of these. Basically fits the program to kill profile very well.
Correct. Now he's back in prison, and then he basically, August of 1975, he gets released from prison. And correct me if I'm wrong, is that the time when they say that overcrowding was the factor?
That was 1970.
Okay, gotcha. Good point. Good to note. And then, so from 75, he's active, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that is, I would say that the period from his release in August of 1975 up until the point where he is recaptured for really the last time for all of the murders that he's committed in Texas and allegedly elsewhere around the country. That whole period and exactly what Henry Lee Lucas was doing in that period is the most controversial part of his life. And that really is the period where he either did his entire murder spree or he really didn't do much killing at all. So that's probably the most vital period of his life to understand what was really going on, and the most divisive for sure.
Correct. So we're talking 1975, like mid 1975, all the way to, let's see here, June of 1983.
That's right.
So that's pretty much like 8 years. Is that 8?
Yeah, very nearly 8 years.
And then, so we have a couple milestones, a couple dates that we can point out that we know he did something, like for sure. or it's, we know with a high degree of likelihood, right? So one of them would be in 1982, August 24th. Henry Lee Lucas killed his girlfriend or common law wife, I guess, however you want to say it, Becky Powell, right?
Yeah, she would have been 15 at the time, and like I said, she was the niece of Henry Lee Lucas's, friend and alleged gay lover at times, and all, of course, alleged murder companion at various times, Otis Toole, who he had met. Otis Toole was from Florida. He and Lucas had met at some point during the 70s, and Henry Lee Lucas, ended up sort of becoming this, father or uncle figure for Otis Toole's nieces and nephews, especially after Otis Toole's mother, who was taking care of them, died. Henry Lee Lucas was especially close to Becky Powell, who he met when she was only 12 years old, and definitely they began this sort of sick, twisted sexual relationship to the point where Henry Lee Lucas really did seem to believe that this underage girl was his girlfriend or wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you read the call book, portions of that really do come across as like a Lolita story, not in a particularly interesting or like literary way, just like having like just an itinerant life with that sort of relationship. It's really bleak, but so we know that date, and like we know that he probably killed her on that date because later on Lucas confessed and was able to actually like show a body. He was able to tell them where her body was, right?
Right. He was able to lead them. He was able to lead. It was a Texas Ranger named Phil Ryan who was really in charge of that early investigation. He was able to lead Phil Ryan to the point where he said he had buried Becky, and they were able to find human remains as well as some of Becky's known clothing. So there is basically no doubt at all that Henry Lee Lucas killed Becky, although even that was something that he attempted to dispute later on,
Mm-hmm.
rather unconvincingly, in my view.
Yeah. The next one would be the following month. So this is September 15th, 1982. Lucas killed Kate Rich in Montague County, Texas. Now, this was that elderly woman, right?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, Henry Lee Lucas and Becky had initially, at least by many of the official timelines, had spent several months in Southern California in a city called Hemet, California, living with a man named Jack Smart and his wife Obera Smart. I was living with them for quite a while, supposedly just doing some odd jobs around their house. And then eventually they basically decided to send Henry and Becky down to Montague County, where Obera Smart's mother, Kate Rich,
Did they
was
not say
living.
it like Montague? Did they not say it? Oh, fucking Texas. I knew when I said it that I was like, they're gonna say it some stupid way in Texas.
Yeah, yeah, it
Gosh
is.
dang
It
it.
is Montague County. I would not have guessed that either if I
Thank
hadn't
you.
seen them say it in the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, basically, so Obera Smart sent and her husband Jack Smart basically decided they wanted to have Henry and Becky go down to help out Obera's elderly mother Kate Rich, who lived in Ringgold, Texas, which is in Montague County. So Henry and Becky lived with Kate Rich for a very short time, but then Kate Rich's other children apparently basically got mad at Henry Lee Lucas and Becky. They thought that they were taking advantage of her, and they basically kicked them out of the house. So then Henry and Becky moved a short ways away to a community called Stoneburg, where there was for this Christian commune called the House of Prayer, run by a man named Reuben Moore. So they basically stayed there on that commune, and but still kept up the relationship with Kate Rich. They would visit her. Kate Rich, seemed to have a very friendly dynamic with Henry. Be like, oh, you got to take me fishing sometime. So they still kept up that relationship, and certainly, the theory was that when after Becky disappeared, and Henry Lee Lucas, just tried to say, "Oh, Becky vanished." One of the stories was she left with a truck driver and hitchhiked with him. One of the theories is that Kate Rich became suspicious about that, suspicious of what he had claimed Becky's fate was, and that he then had to kill Kate Rich to cover for that. And similar to the case of Becky Powell, Henry Lee Lucas actually was able to lead the investigators, lead Phil Ryan to the burial site where he said he had initially killed Kate Rich and disposed of her remains. And then Lucas claimed that he later took Kate Rich to basically his place back in Stoneburg to burn her remains in his stove. And ultimately, Kate Rich's personal items, her glasses and her clothing, were found at the site where Lucas led the investigators to. And in the stove, they were able to find bones that definitely appear to be cremated human remains. So once again, there is basically no doubt that Henry Lee Lucas was involved in that murder too, or unless there was some very additional weirdness going on, which Lucas would somewhat allude to in later allegations of his.
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to understand the chronology. So basically, they arrest this drifter loser guy who basically had a record for killing his own mother, who then basically leads the police to two different graves, essentially, or, produces evidence showing where two bodies are. So, including like essentially like a defenseless old woman, and then also like an underage lover of the guy, right? So like there's not a lot of reason to doubt some the context is important as to why they might listen to further confessions for this guy, given what he had done up to his life that they could prove for sure, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's certainly this guy. I mean, at this point, he can basically be solidly linked to 3 murders over the course of his life. If he has this compulsion, if he's willing to do it to, like you said, a teenage girl, an elderly woman, that what there isn't exactly a reason to doubt that that these are the I'd say there isn't really a reason to think that these are the only times he's ever done this if it seemingly came so naturally to him up until then.
Exactly. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's arrested in June of 1983. He confesses to Becky and Kate's murders, right?
Yeah, he had been a suspect in Kate's murder for quite some time. He behaved pretty suspiciously after that, basically right around the time that Kate Rich disappeared in September of 1982. Henry Lee Lucas also disappeared, just completely up and left the area for a couple weeks. And then he comes back, and he's acting very shifty. He basically keeps telling the House of Prayer, the guy who runs the House of Prayer, Reuben Moore, that he is he's trying to search for Kate Rich and trying to search for Becky Powell. He is acting very sincere about trying to find them, but obviously being the last person, the sort of common link between the two victims, he is a very blatant suspect for the Montague County authorities. So the sheriff, W.F. Conway, and the ranger who is assisting them, Phil Ryan, absolutely believe that Lucas was involved in this. And they're trying to investigate him and trying to hold him. They arrest him a couple of times, or they either arrest him or they bring him in for interrogation a couple times. They arrested him once in 1982 on basically essentially a probation violation for an auto theft charge that he had from Maryland. They tried to interrogate him about it, but they really had nothing to hold him on, and so he was released. And for whatever reason, Maryland also had no interest in extraditing him, so he was free to go. He was brought in for questioning a couple more times, but he never was willing to give anything away. He even was polygraphed. He passed the polygraph when he denied involvement in the murders. He gave a blood sample. This blood sample supposedly, they tried to compare it against blood that was found in an abandoned car of his. That right around the time that he had left Stoneburg in September of 1982, he abandoned the car in California, and there was a blood stain and a knife left in the car. So the authorities tried to compare the blood to samples that they had gotten, but apparently the blood deteriorated enough that there was no match, even though there should have been a match. So they're basically Lucas just kept skating again and again on they never had anything to hold him on, but then finally he allegedly had this weapon which he was not allowed to possess. With his criminal record, he made Reuben Moore aware of it, and so Reuben Moore called the authorities, and then they were finally able to get Henry Lee Lucas, hold him, and they basically put him in a cell where he was cut off from contact with the outside world, not able to get access to cigarettes or anything that he was reliant on. And then he finally made a confession to the jailers, led the investigators to the bodies, and that sort of began the whole next several years of investigation with Henry Lee Lucas.
Yeah. Now, he confesses to Becky and Kate's murders, and then he also begins to tell people that he had murdered other people, right?
Right. When he was arraigned in court on these charges, he essentially ended up telling the judge, what are they going to do about the 100 other women that I've killed? So basically just says outright in front of everyone that he has a ton more victims that he's gotten. And so that obviously catches many law enforcement officers' attention. And while Lucas is really sitting in jail, awaiting trial for these crimes, and then even after he is convicted in some of these crimes, he starts talking about various murders he's committed and describing other murders that he's committed all over the country. He's drawing pictures for them. He's describing places and dates. And now some of them did turn out to be complete bullshit. For one of them, he drew, and identified the school teacher that he had from back in Virginia, and she turned out to be still alive. So he was definitely bullshitting about it. But then there's also some weird stuff that never does get explained. The fact that he's able to lead to this very obscure murder of this girl in Red Bluff, California, back in March of 1983. That again, was not exactly a nationally prominent case, but he was able to allude to this murder and talk about it, and to the point where an investigator from Red Bluff actually just came out and interrogated him about it, and claimed at the time that they came away believing that he was involved in the murder. So even at this early stage, Lucas was able to give at times very specific information that was leading different law enforcement agencies to believe that he had something to do with a lot of different murders all over the country.
That's right. So November of 1983, Henry Lee Lucas is transferred to Williamson County, Texas. And then basically that's when the Texas Ranger Task Force starts up.
Basically, yeah. So the way that it happens is that W.F. Conway, the sheriff of Montague County, effectively he has a friend in law enforcement, the sheriff of Williamson County, a man by the name of Jim Boutwell, he's aware that Jim Boutwell had been dealing with this series of murders around Interstate 35, murders of hitchhikers that have been going on in the late 70s, and that Boutwell really wanted to solve this case. And after realizing, we caught this drifter who is seemingly committed multiple murders, that he might be a viable suspect. And so Boutwell was informed about Lucas as a suspect, and he ended up interrogating Lucas and seemingly, came to believe that Lucas was a good suspect in at least one of these particular murders of a woman who at the time was unidentified and was completely nude aside from a pair of orange socks that she had on. So she would actually just be dubbed Orange Socks in the media. It was not until 2019 when she was finally identified as a woman named Deborah Jackson. But Boutwell basically got Lucas to confess to the murder. I was able to interrogate him about it and got him to confess to the circumstances of it. This would be the case that Lucas ultimately got convicted on a capital murder charge, got the death penalty for, and this would be later become the very controversial case that led to him getting his death sentence commuted. But anyway, Boutwell was the one to secure that confession, and so Lucas was, in the course of that, transferred to the Williamson County Jail, the county seat of it being Georgetown, Texas, and that was where Lucas sat. And ultimately, Boutwell started to come to the sort of realization that W.F. Conway, the Sheriff Conway, had already been having to coordinate the all of these requests for interviews from around the country, people who wanted to talk to Lucas. And when Boutwell brought Lucas to his own jail, essentially Boutwell came up with the idea of getting the Texas Rangers involved to create a coordinating task force to basically make this process a lot more orderly. So he went to the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety, former FBI man named Jim Adams, Colonel Jim Adams, and got the approval. And so the task force was set up under the supervision of Texas Rangers Bob Prince and Clayton Smith. So effectively, the arrangement would be that Lucas was held in the jail in Georgetown. The Rangers would pretty much, the Ranger Task Force would effectively set up shop, and they would be fielding requests for interviews by different law enforcement agencies around the country who wanted to talk to Lucas. They would schedule these interviews. They would make arrangements for these cops to come out and speak with Lucas. They would essentially keep track of all the different cases where Lucas had made confessions to, with basic information, and whether Lucas had been, whether the local agency believed Lucas was involved, and effectively be keeping a log of all the different case confirmations and confessions that Lucas had made throughout this time. So it became a very big nationwide deal, this massive major task force effort that was coordinating probably hundreds of interviews from cops all over the U.S. who were trying to speak with Lucas and see if he could be a suspect in many of their cold cases.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, right, because I think sometimes the whole serial killer thing really mystifies more than it clarifies at times. Because what they have here is a drifter who is already linked to 3 murders, who said that he committed many more. So this doesn't strike me, the task force doesn't strike me as it is a claim oh, they just wanted to start clearing out cases. That is a claim that you would have to prove. But the fact that there would be interest in this drifter who intimated that he did more murders seems like normal, straightforward police work, rather than some sort of weird media circus clearing out. The logic is there, is what I'm getting at.
Right. And of course it is important to note, that the clearances, and this is something that the head of the Ranger Task Force, Bob Prince, would constantly stress to the media, to the Netflix documentary makers, to really anyone who would listen. And he told this to me as well when I talked to him, that the Ranger Task Force was not the ones who were in charge of clearing the cases, because of course we're talking about cases in other jurisdictions around the country. It is the job of the individual local law enforcement agency, the city police department, the county sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, and whatever the place is, they're the ones who have the responsibility for clearing the case. There's not like the Texas Rangers were the ones clearing, closing the books, their own books, because they were, except for certain cases in Texas where rangers may have been assisting other jurisdictions, the rangers were not the ones who were actually had these murder cases on their own books. It was basically set up as more of a logistical entity to coordinate the efforts of different law enforcement agencies.
Precisely.
Yeah, I would say if you want, we can move on to the hand of death stuff. But I guess first, you see the part where I mentioned the background of Jim Boutwell. That would probably be a good thing to talk through, and also a way to bring up Sister Clemmy Schroeder and her role as well.
Yes. Let's see here. All right. So who is Jim Boutwell and how does he figure into this?
Yeah, well, Jim Boutwell was a fairly legendary Texas law enforcement officer, and of course, as I mentioned, he had the connections with the Texas Rangers, with other law enforcement agencies such as Montague County, the sheriff there, and connections right to the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety, which is the agency under which the Rangers operate. But Boutwell does, interestingly enough, have a background that is very much evocative of some kind of intelligence related role. In fact, he is overtly acknowledged to have served in U.S. intelligence, which certainly makes him an interesting figure to be the initiator of this task force and one of the major handlers of Henry Lee Lucas during this period when he is making all these confessions. Basically, Boutwell's law enforcement career.
Real quick, George, let me ask. So what was it? What intelligence was he in prior to the Texas Rangers?
Well, so just to clarify,
Okay.
Boutwell was the sheriff of Williamson County. He wasn't in the Rangers themselves. He was simply connected to them. But Boutwell's background in intelligence really goes back to 1947 when he joined the Texas Department of Public Safety and was actually the second person to be part of their intelligence division. And obviously 1947 is an interesting year as far as intelligence agencies is concerned as well. But yeah, he was the second person in DPS's statewide intelligence division. So he was there for some time, and he ended up in 1956 starting this aircraft sales company. So, ostensibly going into the private sector, although at the same time, he was pretty much he was constantly a part-time deputy sheriff of Williamson County as well. So he really had a foot in both worlds, both law enforcement and private industry. In 1959, he ended up moving to Wisconsin for a brief period to become the vice president and sales manager of Champion Aircraft Corporation there. But interestingly enough, at the same time that he's doing this private sector job, he is working with an unnamed intelligence agency of the federal government. They don't say what it is, but the exact quote is an intelligence agency, and the I and the A are capitalized, so it doesn't take much guessing, in my view, to tell what intelligence agency they're referring to. And his job at the time is acknowledged in newspaper articles. In the newspaper articles that are talking about his later campaign for Williamson County Sheriff, they say that his job, quote, frequently took him to Cuba and Latin America. He was said to be fluent in Spanish in that same interview. And according to the book by Joel Norris and Nan Cuba, they give even more detail on Boutwell, that he actually was involved in helping many prominent Cubans defect to the U.S. So this is right during the time of Castro's revolution, right during the time when a great many of these, many Cuban exiles who will later find themselves in CIA employment are leaving to go to the U.S. And here we have Jim Boutwell, who is supposedly, in the private sector at this time in an aircraft company, is playing a key role for a, quote, intelligence agency in facilitating this. But anyway, so timing is certainly interesting. But a year later, he returns to Georgetown. He manages the local airport there. He, was running a flight school in Austin, Texas. And, he's still, as I mentioned, he was the part-time deputy sheriff throughout this period. So, always had connection with law enforcement, even if his main work was being in private business relating to aviation. Now, in 1966, he actually intersects with the case that Program to Kill readers will probably be quite familiar with. When Charles Whitman got on to basically climb the UT University of Texas Tower and started sniping at people, Charles Whitman, this former Marine who himself had mental background, mental illness that seems somewhat evocative of possible mind control, and is sniping at all these victims. Jim Boutwell actually is flying in an aircraft trying to shoot down Charles Whitman, and his aircraft gets hit.
It's just remarkable.
I know, seeing how these people intersect with these major cases is kind of stunning, and I was certainly stunned when I came across this aspect of Boutwell's background. He was flying an aircraft trying to shoot at Whitman. The aircraft was hit by Whitman's sniper fire, supposedly, but Boutwell became at that point sort of a very well-renowned hero in Texas for his efforts in that. And I guess that sort of propelled his stature to really being this, like I said, legendary lawman. in Texas law enforcement circles.
Wait, real quick. Let me ask George. So basically, we have not only did he try to shoot down Charles Whitman, but that Charles Whitman shot him down?
Or at
least shot at the aircraft.
Yeah, he shot his aircraft, hit his aircraft. I don't know if they would actually shot him down, but certainly he was hit allegedly by Charles Whitman's sniper fire. So
wild. That's so wild.
Yeah, definitely. And then so Boutwell is, I guess, becomes much more of a prominent name, especially in the circles of Texas law enforcement. And in 1978, he actually runs for the Williamson County Sheriff position. Like I said, up until that point, he's sort of been a part-time sheriff's deputy. Now he's running to head up the agency, and he wins the election. He basically ends up becoming sheriff right at the time that these hitchhiker murders are starting, including Orange Socks. And so a couple years later, Boutwell is told about this, and he ends up stepping in, basically taking Lucas into his own jurisdiction, and effectively becomes one of the leading law enforcement figures who is managing access to Lucas for the next couple years.
Gotcha. So he's not a Texas Ranger himself. He is the sheriff. I gotcha.
Yeah, the sheriff of Williamson County, but someone who has an important role in the task force alongside the Rangers.
Very interesting intelligence background for the sheriff of such a high profile case. Okay, cool. Good to note. Very noted.
Bam.
Omar, the director.
Let the band
I look in the mirror and look at a killer. I grew up with niggas crop you out the picture. Bodies keep stacking up year after year. Got the young niggas thinking they serial killers. On choppers with switches, they scratch out the cereal. The blood in the whip, it fucked up its interior. Watch what you say, cause this shit can get real. And watch how you move unless you made a steal. Shot in the car and I got the wheel. These niggas on wood, they got bodies for real. I thought you got out, he did 20 some years. He took it to trial, but he lost his appeal. I went to school with some serial killers. They breaking your house, they need serial with you. The same nigga cut first period with you. Watch who you trust, they might be out to get you. And one wrong step, you get put in a swisher. Say the wrong thing, get put in a backwood. Wipe a nigga no tissue. Bless him. Last nigga tried me, found in the backwood. Ain't none of these crews more vicious. Just play a good role and they show can't act good. Putting folks in my business. Nigga smoke on my name and got smoked like a pack of wood.
I've given up this time. I don't like the way that you're holding me hostage. It hurts when I'm alive. Alive on this earth that you think that you've created. I've given up this time. I don't like the way that you're holding me hostage. It hurts when I'm alive. Alive on this earth that you think that you've created.
How many bags am I dropping a day? My shooter a cheater, we stalking to prey. If you get caught, ain't no walking away, and we ain't doing no talking, just talk to the K. These limited niggas been stay in their places, they like to play games and they know don't play. Playing with WAP, it ain't nobody safe, it won't be no more racks, and nobody safe. Humans got angels just watching from heaven. Wasn't this time he got shot in the face. Mainline say he got caught on the 70, thinking about dropping the tape on the 80. These niggas ain't real, these niggas some fakes. That pressure put on them, these niggas a break. 3 every artist behind the gate that made a mistake, hell, give him a break. Who trying to parole out, they gave him a date. He getting impatient, he trying to wait. The district attorney keep trying to hate. He fighting the feds and fighting the state. I did some time with some sick-minded niggas. Stabbed in his cell and left blood on the pillow. Free all the hitters, they kept it official. Not the ones in the booth that turned serial killer.